Good afternoon. My name is Kyle Roberts, and I am the Executive Director of the Congregational Library and Archives. Welcome to our second annual Acquisitions Afternoon, a virtual program focused on our 2025 Religion of Revolution Adopt-a-Book program with a very special talk by Dr. Frank Bremer on building a library of Puritan history. To begin, I want to acknowledge that the Congregational Library and Archive resides in what is now known as Boston, which is in the place of the Blue Hills, the homeland of the Massachusetts people, whose relationships and connections with the land continue to this day and into the future. For those of you joining us for the first time, the Congregational Library and Archives is an independent research library. Established in 1853, CLA's mission is to foster a deeper understanding of the spiritual, intellectual, cultural, and civic dimensions of the congregational story and its ongoing relevance in the 21st century. We do this through free access to our research library of 225,000 books, pamphlets, periodicals, and manuscripts, as well as our digital archive, which has more than 130,000 images, many drawn from our New England's Hidden Histories project. Throughout the year, we offer educational programs and research fellowships for students, scholars, churches, and anyone interested in Congregationalism's influence on the American story. I hope you will check out our website, congregationallibrary.org, to learn more about what we do and for news of upcoming events. Now, as I mentioned, the inspiration for today's program comes from our new online exhibit, Religion of Revolution, Congregational Voices on Liberty. For the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution, this new digital exhibit highlights the stories of New England Congregationalists through important and rarely seen print works of the period, as well as church records, letters, and sermon literature from the CLA's collection and the New England's Hidden Histories project. We can do exhibits like this because we've been actively collecting print and manuscript materials for the past 171 years. And as we were thinking about Adopt-a-Book this year and putting a spotlight on our acquisitions, we immediately alighted on the idea of our featured speaker, Dr. Frank Bremer, who had recently given to us his library. And you're going to learn more about that in this program. An active acquisitions program allows us to tell the 400+ year story of Congregationalism in all of its complexity and diversity, from Dutch books likely read by the Pilgrims to a 2023 board game on how to grow your church, just to give you a few examples of recent acquisitions. So I'm going to invite Heather Kurtz to come on and introduce you to Adopt-a-Book. Thanks, Heather.
Thank you, Kyle, and welcome to our second annual Acquisitions Afternoon, offered in conjunction with our Religion of Revolution Adopt-a-Book program. 20 staff-recommended selections are up for adoption this year. The staff chose the items for their connection to the American Revolution or other revolutionary moments in congregational and American history. With funds raised through the Adopt-a-Book program, the CLA can provide greater research opportunities and virtual programs, improve access and searchability for future generations through investment in our large-scale inventory project, and make more materials available through digitization in our renowned digital archive. This afternoon, we are delighted to host Dr. Francis J. Bremer, who will be discussing the library of British and North American Puritan scholarly books and microfilm he recently donated to the CLA. Just a little bit about Dr. Bremer. Dr. Bremer has been a student of Puritanism in England and New England for over 50 years. Over the course of that time, he has taught at various institutions, retiring from Millersville University of Pennsylvania in 2011. He has held fellowships at Oxford and Cambridge universities in England and at Trinity College in Dublin, Ireland. He was also a scholar in residence at Queen's College in Belfast, United Kingdom. Dr. Bremer served as editor of the Winthrop Papers for the Massachusetts Historical Society. He has published 19 books and numerous articles in the field and continues to be active, currently working on 4 other projects. In his spare time, he also managed to serve 2 terms on the board of directors for the Congregational Library and Archives. Now, without further ado, we welcome Dr. Bremer.
I really appreciate this invitation and this opportunity to talk about my books and my projects and so forth. I was asked to talk about my collection, and it took me a moment when asked to speak about a collection to realize that my Library of books is, of course, some sort of collection, a term I usually think of more in terms of art or music acquired for the intrinsic value of the various pieces. What I gathered over the years was a collection of books and other materials that were tools that enabled me to teach, research, and write. From when I was in college through my last days teaching at Millersville University of Pennsylvania, many of those tools were acquired to further my teaching, and they included historiographical studies, works on American history in general, and monographs and articles on the broad sweep of colonial history and American religious history, because those covered the subjects I was teaching. But my primary interest and investment was in materials focusing on early modern British history and 17th century New England, the subjects that I was researching and writing about, as well as teaching about. Those materials were essential to the scholarship that produced the books and articles and so forth that Heather just mentioned, as well as various talks that I've given, many of them to public non-academic audiences, since I have always believed very strongly in communicating the factual past to a broad public. My scholarly trajectory was established during my first years as an undergraduate at Fordham University in the Bronx, New York. I took an introductory theology course from Father James Sadowski, in which my understanding of religion was expanded from basic catechetical knowledge to an exploration of the deeper philosophical questions that are central to faith. I already had an interest in New England history, rooted in many summer vacations to the region, and my new interest in theology drew me to the Puritans. What you might call the first acquisition in my collection came in my sophomore year at Fordham, and was a copy of Perry Miller's Errand into the Wilderness essays that were required in a course on American historiography taught by Raymond Cunningham. The title essay led me to continue to question the connection between early New England and early English Puritanism. And 50 years later, I'm still pursuing that link. From Fordham, I went on to study at Columbia University, where I worked with Alden T. Vaughan, with additional classes across the street at Union Theological Seminary that I took from Robert Handy. The libraries of those institutions gave me access to printed primary sources and standard secondary works. But I realized from the start that I needed to keep up with the literature of the field. I scoured journals for reviews of new books and ads for forthcoming studies. The bookstore at Columbia carried university press books in history at the time, until it became a Barnes & Noble's franchise featuring sweatshirts and mugs more than books. There were also local bookstores around Columbia and the Strand bookstore in downtown Manhattan that I scoured for books that were relevant to my interest. Starting when I finished my dissertation, I've been fortunate to have had the opportunity to do research in England and Ireland, funded in part by various fellowships and grants. The habit of roaming the shelves of bookstores was especially important when I was in England on such research trips. In Blackwell's in Oxford, Heffer's in Cambridge, and Foyle's in London, I found many books on English history, particularly Puritanism, that had not been published yet in the US, and some that would never be published here. While early on, my book acquisitions had been items that I purchased, as I became recognized as having some expertise in the field, I was asked to review books for professional journals and to review manuscripts that publishers were considering. On occasion, I also acquired books through the generosity of other scholars. Some sent me complimentary copies of their latest work, including volumes from the English historians Christopher Hill and Dermot McCulloch. That, of course, was when publishers were more generous with author copies, and so that you had to really reach out to find out how many friends you had that would be interested. When my friend and mentor, Alden Vaughan, retired, he sent me some duplicates from his library, including a copy of Palfrey's multi-volume History of New England. When another friend, Mike McGiffert, passed away, his sister allowed me to take what I wanted from his collection. Recently, as chair of the Winthrop Prize Committee of the Colonial Society of Massachusetts, I've acquired copies of books submitted for award consideration. In preparing for this talk, Kyle asked if I could identify a particularly important or favorite book. And I've thought about this a lot, and I really can't. I mean, I think generally what I've viewed as most valuable is the particular book that is helping me to answer a particular question in my research. Although I would imagine that I would say that there's some special sentimental value on copies of books that were sent to me and inscribed by friends. So this is basically how I built my collection. Now, over the years, things have changed in the scholarly world and have changed what you might say is my way of doing business. It's much harder to learn what new books are available or soon to be published. Professional journals review far fewer books, and sometimes by the time a review appears, the book is on remainder tables. Now, I rely on word of mouth for information on new works, as well as scouring footnotes in recent works to see references to something that I missed or is identified as forthcoming. So there are changes. Some of these are positive. I used to subscribe to many professional journals for the articles that might be relevant. But a number of years ago, I trashed all my back copies, including about 40 years of some journals. And I should say that I did try to give them away and no one wanted them, because I find it easier to find a particular article by accessing JSTOR or other online sites. I used to have to travel to access primary sources, but now many of them are online as well. I'm fortunate in having a way to access early English books online and equivalent sources. I do worry about how inaccessible these are to some struggling scholars who are independent, or also to some those who are located in some small universities, because certain collections like the online English state papers and others are, operated or sold to libraries, sold to libraries by companies like Gale and Matthew Arnold, are really so expensive that not every library can afford them, and certainly they're beyond the reach of individual scholars. And in that context, I should stress that some of those institutions, such as the Congregational Library with its New England Hidden Histories project, are extremely valuable in making online manuscripts and other materials available without a cost to the user. When I started out my work, I often used microfiche and microfilm. There are probably some people listening to this talk who have never seen microfiche, although I'm sure they've seen microfilm. My work as editor of the Winthrop papers for the Massachusetts Historical Society was aided by having the 47-reel collection of the Winthrop papers on microfilm. But I no longer have access or easy access to a microfilm reader, and my laptop doesn't have a CD-ROM port to use when examining some collections I have purchased on CD over the years, though I've recently bought an external CD drive. Well, recently, my wife and I moved from our house of 50 years to a 2-bedroom apartment in a continuous care community. One of the bedrooms is now my study, from which I'm talking to you. Knowing that I could not take all of my books with me, I was happy to reach an agreement to rehouse them. The Congregational Library paid to have 41 boxes of books picked up and delivered initially to Providence College to be sorted. I am told that there were over 1,100 of them. I must say I never really kept count of how many books I had collected. My friend and fellow scholar, Adrian Weimer, who teaches at Providence and whom I consider the most promising scholar of her generation in the field of 17th century England and New England history, was allowed to select some volumes that she would find most useful, and then the remainder was sent on to 14 Beacon Street to be placed in the Congregational Library, with those that were duplicates or not wanted to be sold for the benefit of the library. Some of my collection has moved with me, primarily the books I'm using on my current projects, an edition of some William Bradford writings, a biography of Bradford, a study of women in the history of Puritanism, and editing an Oxford handbook on Puritanism. One of my perks as an emeritus faculty member is that I can obtain virtually any book and essay I want through the interlibrary resources of Millersville University, which is a 15-minute drive away. It's not as convenient as having something in my own collection. And there have been a few times over the last couple of months when I've realized that one of the books that I wanted to look at was actually now at 14 Beacon Street in Boston, leading me to get it through interlibrary loan, which entailed a wait of only a few days. As I said, it's not as convenient as having something in my own collection, but it works. Over the years, I've always cherished libraries as quiet places where one can think, conduct research, and also to make contacts with other scholars who can become friends. I'm pleased that my books may help scholars with similar interests to mine who come to the Congregational Library. And with that, I'm willing to answer any questions that anyone might have.
Thanks so much, Frank. That was fantastic. And very impressive that you could that succinctly tell the story of, so many decades of kind of acquiring and shaping a collection. So please use the Q&A function for those of you. We got over 75 people in the virtual audience. It's right on the nav bar, and ask any questions that you have. I've got a ton of questions for you, so I'm just going to kick off. So in studying, the 17th century, the late 16th, 17th century, 18th century, was there ever a time where you were tempted to buy original primary source books? I wonder if you, especially in your travels in England, might have been in used bookstores and found, works from the period. Was that ever something that you flirted with or did do?
I didn't. And I never really flirted with it because a lot of the material I was looking at was would have been very expensive in original editions. I must say that one of the things that I've discovered is that there are a lot of reprints of material that was published in the 19th century that are inexpensive, and I've kept Amazon busy with some of those. But also, early on, I came in touch with the publication efforts of Banner of Truth, which is a Protestant publishing organization based originally, at least in Edinburgh, which reprinted a lot of what they refer to as Puritan classics, so that works of Thomas Goodwin and John Owen and Peter Sterry and various others were made available in inexpensive editions, some of them in paperbacks. They're exciting series of Puritan paperbacks. And it gave me an opportunity to read some of these things. And then if I was going to do any citing in academic works, I could go and look for the originals, copy of the actual thing. But that was very helpful. I must say it also, contact with Banner of Truth also showed me something fairly interesting, because for a while, at least, they had a magazine which they circulated and which, as someone who had ordered a number of books, was sent to me. And the striking thing of that was the number of commentaries in letters and so forth, which identified how people in our society were getting value out of these 17th century Puritan works, and how someone would rave about how, a work by John Owen spoke to their situation and so forth. And so it made me realize that some of the themes that I was looking at continued to become important or to be important over the centuries and still were today. And it helps in some ways to enable me to make connections between certain elements of Christianity today and their roots back in the Puritan past. And in fact, that's one of the essays, the two essays I'm doing in the Handbook of Puritanism really deals with the question of how Puritans and Puritanisms have been interpreted over the centuries from the 17th to the current times.
Oh, fantastic. Yeah, I feel like if you and I were to log on to barnesandnoble.com or bookshop.com, we'd see a lot of reprints, and thinking about the motivation behind it. Is the press a religious press? Is it a scholarly press? That these are works that live on, right, in important ways and have new meanings. And I'm so glad that you've been kind of thinking about that. Some great questions coming in here. So this one from Andrew Belly. Frank, you're going to be one of the few people who can, really look at how the scholarship has developed over the last several decades. And Andrew asks, from that perspective, from the books that you've had and from the people you've known, are there areas of 17th century New England that really have not been explored either recently or as much as they should be, and that you would encourage, the new Frank Bremer, who's just getting his PhD, to focus on?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, when I started out, and one of the first books that I published was called The Puritan Experiment, and it was actually an expansion of notes and sort of lessons that I had done for my doctoral study group at Columbia. We divided up various periods we would ask questions on, and I became the Puritan expert. And at that time, in that book, I tended to fall into the trap that I think a lot of people, a lot of my fellow scholars fell into, and that is to assume that New England was Boston writ large. I mean, that so much of the primary material that we had came from the Mathers, from Cotton, from Winthrop, and so forth. And so it was easy to look at that and say, well, this is Puritan New England. And over the years, what I found is that there's a lot of difference. There's a unity, but there is not uniformity if you look at Puritan New England as a whole. And that prompted my book on John Davenport and the New Haven colony. I'm finding the same thing about Plymouth, working on William Bradford and his writings and so forth. And so I think, there are still areas. In fact, I was on a Zoom call with Adrienne Weimer about a week and a half ago. And, one of the things I mentioned to her that maybe she has a student that would want to look at, since Providence is right in the heart of Rhode Island, is I don't think that anyone has really done the best work that could be done on religion in the Rhode Island colony. We have studies of John Clark, we have studies of Roger Williams, but what about the entire colony and everything that was going on? Jeremy Bangs, who was a good friend, kept telling me about how, he wishes someone would write a history of Scituate and some of the other Plymouth towns that largely were neglected. So, I mean, I think there's a lot of material like that. There are a lot of individuals that, Adrienne, along with David Hall, are putting out a volume this year on Daniel Gookin and his papers. Gookin is someone who I've felt for a long time a biography of would be fascinating because of his transatlantic connections, his involvement with the native populations and so forth. So I mean, I think there is an awful lot as you look around, and plenty of sources that can sustain research into these areas.
That's fantastic. I think one of the things that I'm kind of thinking of as you're talking about this is there's the areas where we haven't done enough work. And then there's the areas where scholars like to go back and kind of quibble with people who came before. And I thought it was very fitting that you singled Perry Miller's work out. Are you somebody who went in to argue with Perry Miller, or are you somebody who went in finding Miller generative, I guess?
On the whole, I've been a real admirer of Miller for what he was able to do and so forth. But in a sense, going all the way back to my master's thesis, I was questioning Miller because the whole thrust of Errand into the Wilderness is that when English Puritans began to open up to possibilities of toleration, that Massachusetts gave up. Massachusetts felt that their errand had failed, and they sort of turned their backs. And starting with my master's thesis, which became my doctoral dissertation and large part of the book, my argument was that connection between English and American Puritanism remained strong throughout the 17th century, and even a little bit beyond, if you want to talk about Cotton Mather as still being a Puritan and having contact with independents and Presbyterians in England. So, yeah, on that particular point, I was critical of Miller. I mean, I wanted to know more. And then as I began to research it, I began to discover that he had missed a lot.
So pivoting a little, Anna Taylor Swingern asks, I've never heard of JSTOR. And maybe this is, because we have a lot of folks who are not professors at universities.
Right.
You want to talk a little bit about some of the online resources. I know sometimes you can find them at your public library, but what are some of the ones you might encourage people to look at?
Well, I mean, I think JSTOR is basically, as I use it, it's an online collection of dozens, I'm not sure of how many professional journals that are accessible. Again, it's a subscription service. So, when I've been fortunate enough to be able to access it through a university library. I don't know, for instance, if someone came into the Congregational Library, and I'll throw this back at you, and wanted to get an article from JSTOR as to whether they can do that through your online computer system.
Well, there's what I would love to do, and what I can do.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I've been blessed in that Millersville does have a lot of online resources. I've been maybe doubly blessed, and I'm not sure I should say this, with 70 some odd people online, but my wife taught for many years at Penn State in their Harrisburg campus, and she continues to have access to their library system online. And there are things that Penn State has that Millersville does not have. And so she has developed, if one looked at the records, an enormous interest in, some aspects of English and early American history.
There's a question I'd like to hear from Noah Bailey about how you decide between what you buy and what you borrow from the library. And I guess if you were sitting with a bunch of people who are just starting out, and really interested in the same subject matter, would you have any advice on what to buy and what to just borrow?
That's a good question. I guess in my own experience, if I thought a book was going to be an important contribution to the field, or if I realized it was going to have a direct relevance to something I was doing, I was researching, I would buy it if I could. Although I will say that, particularly if you're talking about academic books from Oxford or Cambridge or Brill or various others, purchasing became much, much more expensive over the years. I mean, I remember when I would be able to get some books for, $19, $20 from the university press. And, now a comparable book is over $100. So it's difficult. But I mean, the other aspect of this question is that I often purchase books because I knew that our library, which was that of a small state university, was not going to acquire something that specialized. And B, that while I theoretically could request them to buy it, I really couldn't justify that because none of my students would be going into a subject in the detail that they would want to have access to such a book. So, that's basically the thing. When I was still able to, find books on bookshelves, I mean, I could look through them, and that would help to determine how valuable it would be. If you're just dealing with ads or notices, it's more of a gamble. But no easy answer to that, I don't think.
And I was, I want to say I'm really struck by your comments about today, right? And finding out about new books today. And I've appreciated, that when sometimes you've reached out to us about new books that we've acquired, you are really trying to stay on top of everything that's coming out. Does it feel a little ironic that in the digital age where everything, all the information is supposed to be at our fingertips, that it actually isn't as easy to stay on top?
No, there isn't. And I'll take this moment with our large audience to tell you all that the Colonial Society of Massachusetts annually gives a Winthrop Prize for the best book in 17th century New England history or earlier than 17th century. So there's a lot of early things, native stuff and early explorers, which is a very nice prize. You get a nice sort of bust of John Winthrop, which you can do with what you want, and $2,000. And if you have something that fits the bill, send me a note, because it is very difficult to get the word out, so that there are books, that we would like to consider that we never get submissions for. So yeah, I mean, I contacted, the book review editor of some journals and say, even if you're not going to review the book soon, if something comes in this area, can you, drop me a note so I can get in touch with the author and so forth. But yeah, it's awfully difficult. And it's the gap, and I've talked to other scholars about this, the gap between when a book is published and when it's reviewed, if it's reviewed, is very often 2 or 3 years at best.
Yeah. So one of the things that I know from our conversations you and I have had in the past is sometimes the things that you acquire have more in them than you expected. And I guess I'm thinking about the Winthrop papers on microfilm, which if one were to come use them, they might think they're just looking at 17th century documents, but it's actually a little more complicated than that, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, the Winthrop papers are materials that were donated to the Massachusetts Historical Society from the mid 1800s by Robert C. Winthrop, who collected a lot, but then continually added to. And so it's a family archive, which really covers basically 4 centuries of American history. It comes all the way down to recent times, so that, in some of the latter reels of microfilm, you have papers and such relating to all sorts of 20th century members of the family, including some things that relate to former Senator John Kerry, who was a member of the broader Winthrop family and who vacationed with them and so forth. And so, someone wanting to do a biography of Senator Kerry, and I'm sure there will be some of those written, should really look at the Winthrop papers, because it's a valuable resource. Now, there are things that are also not mentioned. I mean, the published Winthrop papers go up to 1653, and there was work on some additional stuff. But, the later 17th century, most of that material was not published. There were some lacuna. I mean, when Mary Beth Norton was working on In the Devil's Snare. She was curious as to Winthrop comments on the witchcraft in Salem, because you had a Winthrop who was a member of the Court of Oya and Terminer, and there was nothing there, which leads you to wonder if these people who tended to write a lot just didn't want to write about it, or one of the things you always have to worry about when you're getting a collection donated is, did the donor pull some stuff out that they thought they'd rather not see their family be talked about for? So I suspect that there were late 17th century Winthrop comments on what was happening in Salem that we don't have a copy of.
And I can attest in the conversations that we have with manuscript collections that come in that there's that impulse to protect or to shield. And my answer is always the same. You can decide that you don't want people to look at it for a couple of years, right? You can embargo it, but by removing it from the record, there is going to be somebody later on who's potentially going to want to see it.
Yeah. Well, I'll give you an example of this. One of the things that John Winthrop kept a spiritual diary of a fairly decent size from when he was in England into really the last entry, probably when he first got to Massachusetts. So this is largely English. And Robert C. Winthrop Jr., when he published his 2-volume Life and Letters of John Winthrop, copied large portions of that into his biography, basically Life and Letters. But he didn't donate the actual volume. Now, over the years, going back to Worthington, Chauncey Ford, virtually every editor of the Winthrop paper, including myself, has gone searching for that among family papers. And I have to say that members of the Winthrop family, John Winthrop in Charleston, Nate and others in the Boston area, were very welcoming and very helpful, letting me rummage through shelves and everything. But no one's ever found the spiritual diary. Now, you might say, well, Robert Winthrop copied it out, and he did, except there's this one point where in copying out the diary, he says, there next comes a list of the governor's sins, which he recorded, but which will be of no interest to anyone. Well, goodness gracious, it's of interest to me. I think would be of interest to a lot of people. And it might very well be that was the one thing that caused him to say, well, we're not going to give this away. I doubt that he would have destroyed it. I mean, it was a precious manuscript. I suspect it's somewhere out there, probably not identifiable, easily identifiable. But yeah, that tendency to give, but maybe not give everything.
Yeah. Well, I love the point too that, I think it's easy to think today that we have great institutions that have been collecting. We've been collecting for 172 years. That sense that everything's been collected. Mm-hmm. And it's just not true, right? There are so many things out there to be discovered. I think we're much more attuned to what's in printed books. Dealers 100 years ago would have been erasing all the marks. And, I think scholars like you and others, that's the first thing you want to see, right?
Yeah. Well, and again, to use an example with the Winthrop papers, because there were ultimately 6 volumes printed, I've run across a lot of scholars who essentially assume that that's everything Winthrop over that span of years. But the fact is that this was a publication project that began about 1918. And over the years, while volumes were printed, other materials were discovered and put in the manuscript collection, which never got printed. So there's material even dealing with John Winthrop and John Winthrop Jr. and so forth that is in manuscript form in the MHS that might not be in the published volumes, and it might not be on the microfilm because the microfilm was done in 1976. So,
So as scholars, you need to look in every possible corner,
That's right.
follow every possible path. It's a great comment here from Charles Hambrick Stowe, another scholar like yourself who has also been dealing with a large academic library collection that he had gathered. And he's moved to a new home, and he's thinking about, he has been downsizing. And he writes, besides donating some books that weren't duplicates to the Congregational Library, and thank you so much, Charlie, for sending those to us, he's resorted to selling a great many to the Midtown Scholar Bookstore in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. Now, the Midtown Scholar Bookstore gives you pennies on the dollar, but at the least the books are not going directly to the landfill. It's also a great new and used bookstore in a renovated theater, and for people who love such places, it's a great place to visit. And that reminds me a little. I mean, this isn't your first downsizing, right? I think you downsized when you retired, right?
When I retired, I pulled out all the books that were relevant to my research and brought them home. But it left all those books I alluded to earlier, books on historiography, on general American history, on the Revolution, on the social gospel movement, and so forth. And I donated them to the History Club at Millersville, which conducted a sale and sold them to various students and raised, I think they raised about $800 for, History Club projects, trips, and everything else. So I've been very lucky. I mean, fictional works I had a lot of English detective novels, were taken by the local public library. So I've never had to dump any books or consign any books to a landfill. And I hope that continues to be the case.
Well, we will make sure that continues. And when you're done writing about Plymouth and totally bored of it, we will be very happy to take those great books. Just a few comments here, and then we'll let Dr. Bremer go. There's a question about, is there a listing of books from your library that are at the Congregational Library? Not yet, but there will be soon. So Megan Wright, our librarian, is working with them now. And we will, when they are all fully up in the catalog, you will all know, if you're on our mailing list, that they're there. And we will also put, and this is, I think, an important thing that libraries like to do, that it came from your library. So that if somebody, in 20 years wanted to say, well, what were the books that Frank had when he was writing this? They can do a search and they can find that.
Well, and if it's a book in which I wrote any comments in the margin, they'll be able to look at that and say, boy, he was awfully dumb about this subject. Wasn't he?
They're not going to say that. They're going to laud your genius. Also great notes here. So for those of you who live in Massachusetts, if you have a Boston Public Library account, you have access to JSTOR. So great thing, go to the Boston Public Library site and see, sign up for a card if you don't have one already. And lots of, so many other great questions. A good question here, and it's not one that maybe you have an answer for, but one for us just to kind of think about what happens when we don't pay attention. Jesse Garner asks, what has happened to the libraries of New England seminaries that have closed, such as Bangor up in Maine and Andover, Newton? And I know for Andover, Newton, a lot of those materials went to Yale, but there are certainly books that were sold off to dealers. Eastern Nazarene, which is here in Boston, down in Quincy, they closed last spring. And their books are already being sold by book dealers. So there's a challenge, right? In some ways that your library, my library, the Congregational Library has grown because people have sold their books. We need that circulation for things to grow. But there is, when you have these great collections that have a real focus, when you lose it.
Well, and I can interject that one of the libraries that I benefited a lot from during my years at Millersville was the library at Lancaster Theological Seminary, because they had copies of things like the Congregational Historical Transactions from England, which no other library in the area really had, including Penn State. So particularly when you're looking at aspects of religious history, I mean, seminary libraries often have materials that you're not going to find in any more general collection.
And I think, what you're saying there too is a good reminder that not everything is digitized, right? I mean,
Mhm.
you talked about letting go of past issues, but you probably did those for journals that you knew, that when you were contacting the library to take them, you knew that they were in JSTOR, you knew that they're online. But especially here at the library, we have so many publications that were for, kind of niche audiences or smaller groups, or just came from, research groups that didn't have the money. It costs a lot of money to get your stuff digitized. So a reminder, folks, that do keep us in mind as
Right.
you're thinking about what to do with your works.
And I will shout out Tricia for the wonderful work with the digitization of materials in New England hidden histories, because there's go back to the question of what else is there to write about. I mean, that's an extraordinarily rich source for people who want to look at aspects of religious history. And I know that Laurie Stokes has benefited a lot from that. I've benefited from it, and many others. And there are some very good search guides, particularly for for Black history and church history and so forth on that.
And Lori actually has a book coming out this year or early next year, all based on her work at NEHH, which we are so excited for. So I'll end this with a final, this is not a question, but a note of enormous thanks to Frank. And this is from our good friend Adrian Weimer, who says, thank you for your books and even more for your incredible contributions to the fields of Puritan and early American history. So thank you.